Morning, guys. This is Michael, teacher turned trucker. We're going to be working through John 18, verses 25 to 32. There's some stuff that's really straightforward, but then there's some things that are cultural that between the Jewish religious system and the Gentile system, the civic or civil system, that are not quite as evident. So I found that pretty interesting this morning. There's also an application, and this is, I think, what the focal point will be for the takeaway today. What the religious leaders were willing to not overlook, what they were willing to overlook in the process of having Jesus put to death. So we're going to start in verse 25. Meanwhile, Simon Peter was standing in the courtyard warming himself. They said to him, "You aren't one of his disciples too, are you?" Peter denied it. "I am not." Excuse me. One of the high priest's slaves, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, said, "Did I not see you in the courtyard with him?" Then Peter denied it again, and immediately a rooster crowed. I didn't really see anything particular that stood out to me this morning as much as in the section coming up from here. But it is interesting that even though Peter was recognized, he was willing to lie. So that shows the depth of perhaps fear. It would be interesting to have been in Peter's mind at this time to know what's going on, that he would be willing so easily to deny Christ. I don't say that to minimize the potential repercussions, but it does seem that the religious leaders at this point were focused on Christ himself, to stand to reason that they were wanting the disciples afterwards is logical, though. But moving in to verses 28 to 32. Then they brought Jesus from Caiaphas to the Roman governor's residence. Now it was very early morning. They did not go into the governor's residence so they would not be ceremonially defiled, but could eat the Passover meal. A couple things here. It's bad if you're going somewhere early in the morning. This just furthers the image that this is being done in secret. This is outside the normal hours. This is not something that would naturally have occurred. At least not in our culture. I don't think back then. But the last part, they did not go into the governor's residence, so they would not be ceremonially defiled. There's a couple things to take from this one. First of all, it wasn't so much the residence that previously would have been viewed as defiling them, because they're equating the residence of the Gentile with having touched a dead corpse. This shows their utter contempt for the Jews, which is really in stark contrast considering what's going on here. But they were so focused they wanted to be able to eat the Passover meal. Now, in the commentary I wrote, the Christ the night before had partaken of what they believed to be the Passover meal. That was a Paschal lamb itself, and then there was a feast of sorts that continued on 7 days afterwards. And that's kind of where this commentator landed, that this is what they're talking about. They'd already done the Passover meal. Now they want to be able to participate in the next 6 or 7 days of feasting. That's kind of what's in view here. So take the irony there for what it is. So Pilate came outside to them and said, "What accusation do you bring against this man?" Apparently this element was relatively normal. When the Jewish leaders would bring someone, it was not uncommon for them basically just be seeking a stamp of approval for the governor to do whatever they wanted. So essentially the Jewish leaders would try the case, and then they would get the approval of the governor. So that's kind of what's in view here. But verse 30, they replied, "If this man were not a criminal, we would not have handed him over to you." This indicates that they did not openly tell the governor that they had tried him. Now, whether this was because they were trying to be secretive, or just hope that Pilate would overlook that and assign guilt and condemnation all from himself. That's probably what it was. And then look in verse 31, Pilate told them, "Take him yourselves and pass judgment on him according to your own law." This part here reinforces the idea that the Jewish leaders had not told him that they had already passed judgment, which he would have expected them to have done already. The Jewish leaders replied, "We cannot legally put anyone to death." And here's the crux. This statement is not actually true. They could not legally put someone to death. The reason they could not legally put someone to death isn't that they couldn't do it, but because of the circumstances for which they were trying to do it. What I mean by this is, if it had been an issue of their religious law, blasphemy, something to do with the religious system that the Mosaic law had ordered was worthy of death, those things they could have taken them out and had them stoned. But remember, earlier in chapter 18, they're not trying Jesus and putting him to death based on religious law. They tried to get him to confess essentially to sedition. And the reason they're trying to do that is because that is under the jurisdiction of Pilate, and they want Pilate to be the one who judges and condemns. Okay? Because also remember the prophecy that Jesus would be crucified. Not a bone would be broken on the lamb. If they had killed him or had him put to death the way the Jewish system would have with the stoning, it is very likely bones would have been broken. So this is to fulfill the prophecy. And so in verse 32, this happened to fulfill the word Jesus had spoken when he indicated what kind of death he was going to die. So again, this is another one of the prophecies where Jesus said ahead of time he would be crucified, and then the reasoning for it is this way. It was unusual for a bone not to be broken when they're crucified. So let's just kind of wrap some of this stuff up. Let me just kind of glance at my notes here. So they had the authority to put Jesus to death for blasphemy, for something against their religious system. But the reason they chose not to do that, I think, is fear. If they had attempted to put Jesus to death on their own authority as indicating he had done something against the religious law, imagine the backlash from all of those who had seen him perform miracles and questions that he's speaking here and the leaders aren't saying anything. Remember some of those statements periodically through the Gospels. If he were guilty, they would have stoned him much sooner. Obviously, we know, and it's funny because it came up in the sermon last night, his time had not yet come. So this is part of the issue here. But I also want to focus on the idea of the ceremonially clean, because this is actually the big takeaway for me. What were the religious leaders willing to do? What were they not willing to do? They were willing to abstain from something that would make them ceremonially unclean, a process. Even in the midst of doing something that was internally defiling them, the sin of condemning an innocent man. And how often are we willing to do something because it checks a box, or not willing to do something because we know it's not the right box to check, while doing other things? I think this is one of those areas, especially those who I come out of a legalistic system where it's the do's and don'ts. You're focused on those, and it's a hard mindset to break. Where that's our focus, instead of the love, the joy and enjoyment of Christ, which leads to obedience. They're focused on the external and doing versus simply being obedient, following the commands that were given to him, because they're willing to overlook the simple fact that he was innocent. Because they were so envious, they were so jealous, they were so hateful, they were so malicious towards Christ. They didn't care that he was actually innocent. And so that is an interesting element in this. So I encourage you, and this is for myself too, what is it we do in our day-to-day lives, perhaps, or weekly, that we do routinely, but it's not from a heart of obedience to Scripture? So this is where it'd be a call to reflection. And at this point, I haven't had enough time to really sit and meditate on this. So that'll be my goal for today. So that's where we're going to leave this one today. This is an interesting one. It has a very evident challenge for us. I encourage you guys to maybe put comments below. If you've gotten any value, hit the thumbs up. Again, this is Michael, teacher turned trucker, and you guys have a great day.